Hi. So I believe that the music of 1875, post-romantic music from 1875 to the present day, can very basically be broken down into two distinct groups. One is tonal music, and the other is atonal or experimental music. Well, experimental music that is sometimes atonal. So my reorganization of MITA would be to study those two groups separately. And so the first unit would be the tonal side of music, and the second one would be the experimental side. And I think that the upside of doing that is that you're able to really look at how the timeline changes, on both sides of the music. So in tonal, we start with the music of Mahler and Strauss, and we would build our way through the nationalist composers and then through the traditionalist composers, and we would get all the way. I guess those would be the three things, and we would see how their music would develop and how each later composer builds off of what the previous did, or how they were inspired by them, and then so it's much. I think it's a more effective way of analyzing a whole genre of music. And then the second side, we would look at the experimental music by itself and see how Schoenberg's innovation of serialism carries through, and how composers in the 1950s and 60s were using Schoenberg's same innovations and ideas in their own music, and they were adding their own unique. They were adding their own unique interpretations of it and whatnot. So for the first chapter, I'm gonna call it Romanticism's Last Hurrah, because that's what it was. It's gonna feature the music of Mahler, Strauss, and Giacomo Puccini, La Boheme, Mahler's Sixth Symphony in A major, and Strauss's Der Rosenkavalier. And so those composers that's what they were. They were Romanticism's last hurrah. They were doing pieces with 120 people, just huge chromatic harmonies, and just massive works with massive orchestras. And so that was kind of Romanticism's last hurrah. I said that about 3 times. And then we would look at the nationalists, and so I would call this chapter My Homeland. And so basically we would be looking, this would feature Bedřich Smetana's Ma Vlast from the Moldau, Mussorgsky's, Sousa's Sousa's Stars and Stripes Forever, and Copland's Suite from the ballet Appalachian Spring. So we would look at these composers and see how they utilize a lot of romantic qualities with their beautiful melodies, and they would use a lot of things that would represent their homeland. So Smetana would use this flurry of flute scales and stuff that would kind of represent his homeland river, and then so there were those, and then he would use folk songs from his homeland. So there's that, and then we would look at jazz and American music. That's kind of like the last part of tonal music, and we would go through jazz and see how it develops from ragtime through the blues with Louis Armstrong and up to bebop with Charlie Parker. And so we kind of see that development, and then we would look at American music and how jazz, which is the true American music, played its way into the classical scene and more of the orchestral music. And so then we would look at that with George Gershwin's Summertime from Porgy and Bess. And so that's an opera written by Gershwin that has a lot of jazz influence. I mean, it's obviously heavily influenced by jazz. And we would also look at Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, which is a classic staple of American music, and which is also heavily influenced by jazz. And then the second unit, we would move on to the experimental side. We would start with I called the first chapter Organized Chaos, because in a time when this music was being premiered in 1912, we had just gotten over the Romanticism and all of that beautiful music that everyone was so accustomed to hearing, and then we go to something so different. And so I call it Organized Chaos because to the untrained ear, it does sound like chaos. It doesn't sound like music. It just sounds completely all over the place. But it is very organized, very well thought out, and very artistic. And so organized chaos would feature Schoenberg, the innovator of serialism, Pierre Lunaire knocked in 1912, and then also in the same chapter would be the works of Verger's Ionization, the percussion piece written in 1929, and also Oliver Messiaen's Quartet for the End of Time written in 1940. So in this one chapter we have music of Schoenberg from 1912 all the way to Olivier Messiaen in 1940. And so, like I said, this kind of summarizes my reorganization for MITA in this manner, because we look at Schoenberg and then we study Verger's percussion piece of Ionization, which is, and then we go to Olivier Messiaen, and you see the progression of serialism over those 30 years, and you see all the things that are very similar and then things that are different. Verger took Schoenberg's pitch-orientated serialism and instead used it for non-pitched instruments, percussion, and Olivier Messiaen took Schoenberg's serialism and added his own unique elements. He was a very big fan of bird watching and calls, so he kind of incorporated that into his music. And then lastly, our final chapter would be the modern avant-garde, where we look at music from about 1955 through the 1970s. And these composers were really doing anything and everything to make music that had not been heard before, stuff that was completely unique and just really out there. But they would still apply Schoenberg's serialism to their music, so it still had organization. It was still well thought out. So a lot of these avant-garde composers would apply Schoenberg's pitch class serialism, and they would instead apply it to also rhythm, timbre. So they would toy with these different elements of music that would, like the rhythm and the timbre, that would just create new sounds that no one had ever heard before. And so for this chapter, I've got Karl-Heinz Stockhausen Gesang der Junglins in 1954, which was the fully electronically created serialist piece. And then also John Cage's Aria with Fontana Mix in 1958. So both those composers were doing extremely avant-garde and just very out there things that a lot of untrained ears, and mine as well, we kind of hear it. I mean, it just sounds like a crazy jumbled mess, but there is a lot of depth to it, and it does this music from 1960 ties in a lot with the music of Schoenberg and even the late Stravinsky in the early 20th century. So that's my reasoning for this reorganization of MITA. I think that being able to study genres very closely over a long period of time, over about 50 years, and not having to jump back and forth between tonal music and then going to experimental music, and then looking at the nationalists and then going back to the avant-garde. That approach, I think it works, but it's hard to kind of go in depth and look at how the music has changed over time and draw the comparisons between composers of the same genre over different decades. So that's my reasoning. And on that note, I would like to thank you, Professor Winter, for a great year. I learned a lot in your class. I had a lot of fun, and I thought it was a great class. And also Josh and Anastasia, you guys were great. Thanks for helping us out all the time. And yeah, I hope to see you around next year. Thank you.